want to comment that when you're making a spiritual point, like we need to trust God more than we trust things, the people slow down and let it soak into their mind.
And we'll be able to soak in several things as we go through. And there's a couple things I want to focus on today. Specifically, there's some great things that we're going to be able to spend some time and kind of talk about today. So, as we go through chapters 13 and 14, again, a high level, we'll do some, we'll look at a few of the verses. We're going to look at a couple of the questions in the book also to help us go through at a high level of what's going in here in 13 and 14. And that's when we'll kind of be able to go back. After that, we'll go back, open it up, talk about some more spiritual applications, talk about some verses that are that stuck out to you and how they impact us today. So, starting here, we have the this first section here. Just the first couple of verses here. We've got the introduction in verse 1, and then 2 through 5. We've got what God is planning to do to Babylon. Someone read for me just real quick, verse 3.
I myself have commanded my consecrated ones and have summoned my mighty men to execute my anger and my proudly exalted ones.
Yeah, God is calling his mighty. This is God calling together his armies for this judgment that's about to occur, right? And if we look in our workbooks in question number 2, what day did it say that this is going to happen on?
Day of the Lord.
Yeah, the day of the Lord. Now, we've talked about the day of the Lord before. We've talked about what that means in general. What is the day of the Lord? When we see that phrase, what does it kind of mean to us?
God's judgment on his people.
Mm-hmm. There is a time of judgment, or there's a time of testing that will occur on the people. And here, this time of judgment is specifically about those folks in Babylon, right? There is a day of the Lord that is coming for Babylon, a judgment that will be there for them. So if we look at the next section here in chapters 13, God is calling in this first section his armies together, talking about his great might that he's going against, that he's bringing against Babylon. In the next section, we've got a longer section here from verses about 6 down to 16, where he describes this day of the Lord. Okay, and this is one I do want to come back and talk a little bit about, but he really describes the day of the Lord, and verses 9 and 10. Let me get another reader for 9 and 10 and look at some of the illusions or the imagery is the word I'm looking for, the imagery that he's using here. Verses 9 and 10.
Behold, the day of the Lord comes cruel with wrath and fierce anger to make the land a desolation and to destroy its sinners from it. For the stars of the heavens and the constellations will not give their light. The sun will be dark at its rising, and the moon will not shed its light.
Okay, so questions 3 and 4 in your book real quick, as we just read. 3, what's happening to the stars, the sun, and the moon? Darkened. Yeah, they're all darkening, right? What about number 4? What would happen to the heavens and the earth on the day of that fierce anger? Yeah, it's going to shake. It's going to tremble. It's going to shake. Where have we heard this kind of language before? This, talking about the stars and the being darkened, and the sun and the moon and the constellations and the earth shaking. What kind of language is this? Where have we heard it before?
Matthew 24.
Okay, where else? Revelation. Anyone come up with Ezekiel as well? Right? There's this type of language. Anyone know off the top of their head what that kind of language, when we're talking about this destruction, what we're talking about, or what it's called as a whole? Bingo. Apocalyptic language, right? Apocalyptic language, with this imagery of darkness everywhere. This is what you said, right? Or did I point to the wrong person?
No, she did it.
Okay, great. You laughed at like I pointed to the wrong person. That's right. But we've got this apocalyptic language here, this style found in several places throughout the Bible, talking about stars being darkened, the earth shaking, heavens being trembling, and this figurative way of talking about the severe judgment to come. And really, you have this imagery, this complete picture of something that was very stable, like a nation, and what's going to happen to it. This very stable thing like the earth, and what's going to happen to it. God is going to make it unstable. He's going to make it tremble and shake and fall apart. It was an incredibly powerful, strong nation, and it will just tremble and fall down. It was a very bright and a nation that was very populous and huge, and this imagery of the difference between light and darkness. This contrast of what they were before, being a powerful and mighty nation, and this bright nation, and now darkness. White imagery that is being used here to show just how far they have come from before the judgment and after that judgment. Any comments on that before we move on? I think that's an important point to think about apocalyptic vision and the imagery that's there versus some of the many other ideas of apocalyptic vision on how it will literally be fulfilled.
Yeah, using language like sun and moon and stars and constellations, only God the Creator has the power to affect those things, or man cannot.
Yeah. And I think that's an excellent point to bring out in this section as a whole, because as God is using these other nations, and as you studied on Wednesday, as God is using these other nations to using them for His judgment, His tool of righteousness, right? He's using all these nations, and I think that fits in with that imagery of God is in control of all these nations. Wicked or not, He's using them to His purpose. He is in control of all things. And whether that nation is Assyria, whether that nation are the Medes, Babylon, doesn't matter. And I think we see that same type of theme throughout many of the books of the Bible. Daniel, that is like the theme throughout. God's in control of everything. I mean, there's nothing out of His control. There's nothing out of His limit that He can use when it comes to the salvation of His people, to His ultimate plan through Jesus Christ, right? And I think Ryan mentioned on Wednesday or before about the providence of God, all the things that God does, all the tweaks He makes, all the things He does to get to that eternal purpose, that eternal plan of Christ. All the things that He is able to do, nothing's out of His control.
So in the hands of somebody with an ulterior motive, or maybe who just is uninformed, apocalyptic literature can be very dangerous.
Oh, yeah.
I mean, it's the temptation to literalize everything that you see.
Yeah.
I think is we do it with Matthew 24. We do it with Revelation. I mean just generically, not you and I, but like the literalization of apocalyptic literature makes it so that you end up losing the whole point of it, like the lesson that you're supposed to learn.
Yeah.
The sun is, just because the day of the Lord comes, it doesn't mean the sun is literally darkened, and the moon does not literally turn to blood, and the stars are not literally falling from the heavens. It's just the things that you rely on. You build your houses on the earth. You build cities on the earth. The earth is unshakable. The earth is your foundation. The heavens are consistent. You can chart them, map them. The Babylonians used the heavens as their guide for, choices that they made. They had astrologers who would follow the heavens, and the astrologers would tell them how to live and what the gods were trying to communicate. And so you end up missing the whole point of this apocalyptic literature. We're going, when is God going to darken the sun, and the stars are falling from well, that's not the point of it. And so you miss the point of Matthew 24. You miss the point of Ezekiel. You miss the point of Revelation.
Yep.
And I don't want to say it boils down to just a feeling, but the fact is that apocalyptic literature is visual literature. You're supposed to close your eyes and imagine it and say, okay, what would the feeling be of having my whole world shaken? That's what it is. Your foundation is being shaken. Your thing that you rely on is being dismantled. Imagine in your mind's eye what it would be like to have your stars falling from the heavens, like the stars of your life.
Yeah. And like you said, with the individuals that take that out of context and use, I think we see that same type of example of people that do that very thing when you look forward to the time of Christ. They had all of these scriptures that they were using and looking for a very literal interpretation about a king, about a Messiah, about a ruler that was bringing them out of slavery, out of the nation of Rome, the captivity that they had in Rome, right? They were looking for a very literal image of the Messiah, and they were using those scriptures to justify putting Christ on the cross, right? So that in itself should be an excellent example of taking imagery of God and assuming that we know what it means when, this is God's imagery to us. Be careful how we use it and how we use it how we interpret it, right?
I want to go to Deuteronomy 11 and start in verse 12. And it says, Yahweh your God takes care of this land. The eyes of Yahweh your God, if you can have some kind of phenomenal thing to imagine his eyes. Your God are on it always, from the year's beginning to its end. And it is most sure that if you faithfully obey the commandments I enjoin on you today, loving Yahweh your God and serving him with all your heart and all your soul, the message that we received this morning. I will give your land rain in the season, autumn rain and spring, so that so that you may harvest your corn, your wine, your oil. I shall provide grass in the fields for your cattle, and you will eat and have all you want. That's a lot. Take care your heart is not seduced, that you do not go astray, serving other gods and worshiping them, or the anger of Yahweh will blaze out against you. He will shut up the heavens, and there will be no rain. The land will not yield its produce, and you will quickly die in the prosperous land that Yahweh has given you. And the whole point is, he's trying to build a spiritual house. And he can't do it if you're contrary to his commandments, his laws, his statutes.
Yeah.
It's like my older brother and sister, I learned from them, from my mom, because they would cross some boundaries and suffer those consequences. Yeah. So, you watch and you pray like the Bible says, and you won't be seduced in those kinds of things.
Yeah. Yeah. I think this is a really good section to come to as well, because I think, as you look at God blessing the people and the promises that he's giving to the people, he also warns them over and over and over again. Hey, look, I'm your God. I'll take care of you. But if you worship, if you go to other gods, if you turn from me, there's going to be consequences. And when we get to Isaiah didn't just happen immediately, right? But God has been so patient with his people.
Right.
They have been allowed to come to him over and over again. And as we look, we might take a minute to look at Mount Gerizim and Mount Ebal, the blessings and the cursings, and look at all the things that God warns them. Just like what we read here, you're going to have your grass in your fields for the cattle. They will eat, be satisfied. But if you don't, In verse 17, it says, all right, he's going to shut up the heavens so that there'll be no rain. Ground will not yield its fruit. You'll perish quickly, right? He goes through the blessings and the cursings in much more detail, things that we literally read in the Bible that has happened to the nations over and over and over again that were fulfilling what happened when they turned from God. They did not take heed of those warnings. And because they did not take heed of those warnings, his last and final, hey, look, here's what I'm going to do if you don't pay attention, is I'm going to give you over to the nations around you. And that's where we're at.
And so when we examine the things we see on the news today in our nation, so much catastrophe, so much destruction, and just because it hasn't happened right here in Shelby County, we shouldn't dismiss that this is still God's hand. Something's wrong with the nation. There's too much destruction going on.
We also have to keep in mind as we look at all that destruction, keeping in mind that everything that's happened, right, that we read in the Old Testament, as we go through and look towards the eternal purpose, the eternal plan that God had, these nations' destructions actually led to Christ. Okay? These nations, the way that they took their enemies and the way that they actually took the enemies in and kept them alive, okay, and dispersed them throughout the land. Okay, that didn't always happen when you went in and conquered someone. You go and conquer someone, you go and wipe them out. So at this point in time, God is using a nation, several nations, Assyria and Babylon, that go in and take individuals out of their conquered area and disperse them. That remnant that God always talks about, right? God is using them for exactly his plan and destroying these other nations and the judgment on them to lead to Christ. So with that said, we also have to be careful because Christ has already come. So if we look at the nations today and all the destruction and all the things that humans do against each other because we're humans and awful people, right? If we look at it the same way in the same direction as we do it for some of these nations, in these wicked nations in the Old Testament, and try to come up with maybe the same kind of conclusions, we have to catch ourselves. Because God's purpose and plan was to get us to Christ. Okay? And he used whatever tool it was to get to salvation. Now, I'm not saying at all that God doesn't do that anymore to lead us to salvation, because those that were in the Esther class, we talked about providence quite a bit just in this last class, and God still does quite a bit in our lives. And you have, I think we all know stories about Christians, weird, crazy stories. Like, I can't believe that was how you met so-and-so that taught you the gospel, right? God has everything still in his control in order to lead us to salvation, right? So he can do crazy things that we could never imagine and line things up with his providence to lead towards the outcome of the saving of an individual. Just like we saw in Esther, he does amazing things to save his people. But keep in mind, there's a different perspective now. We have a different goal as Christians today from God's plan from the Old Testament leading to Christ. Our goal today is to teach Christ to as many people as we can. And sometimes that means that we go over to a nation where God is not known very well because of all that suffering, and we have a much better influence because of everything that's going on in that nation. Okay, just a thought there. We're getting a little behind. Any more comments before we go ahead and continue? Okay, so where are we? Isaiah 13. So if we keep going, look at what's going to happen with this section here, verses 17 and 18. Specifically, who's mentioned here that's going to come up and destroy Babylon? Yeah, the Medes, called out here in verses 17. I'm going to stir up the Medes against you, right? Now, Babylon is, they're kind of in the picture at this point, but who's the threat? Assyria. Babylon's not going to happen for a while. And already Isaiah is calling out what's going to happen after Assyria. Babylon's going to come in, and then Medes are going to come in, and they're going to wipe out Babylon. So it's interesting to have this perspective well ahead of what's happening here. Okay, so this image of just how far Babylon is going to fall. They once were this glorious kingdom. If we look in verse 19, Babylon, the beauty of kingdoms, the glory of the Chaldeans' pride will be as when God overthrew Sodom and Gomorrah. Another throwback to Sodom and Gomorrah about the complete and utter destruction that's going to happen. I think this is an important point that I'll make again in a minute. We look back to Sodom and Gomorrah as imagery in our minds when we think about complete and utter destruction, right? Do we look forward from Sodom and Gomorrah and think of all the places forward that could be related to Sodom and Gomorrah? Okay, hold that thought. We'll come back to it in a couple minutes. All right, so who's going to possess Babylon? Verses 23. What does it say? Who's going to eventually put? I'm not sorry, not verse 23. Yeah, it is 23. 22.
Jackals, stuff
Yeah.
like that.
Yeah, and it's just going to be this wasteland. Okay, the only thing that's going to possess it are these wild animals. Okay. Yep. And oh, that's why. My notes are off. I'm sorry. I was like, that question, that is verse 23. What's going on there? There is no verse 20. Okay. So chapter 14, we start with this downfall of the oppressive nations. God is promising hope now to his people, this promise to restore them. And again, that same theme of God is in control over all things. He's actually going to use these nations to help bring his remnant the hope and the restoration that he promises them. And even in verse 3, what does it say there at the very beginning of verse 3? And it will be in the day when the Lord gives you rest from your pain and turmoil and harsh service that you will have, which you have been enslaved, that you will take up this taunt against them, right? So we've also, while we've looked at that verbiage, the day of the Lord, we've also looked at this same idea of in that day, on that day. Does that mean specifically it's June 22nd and on that day all these things will happen? No. Does it? Sometimes it can mean, okay, these are the next things that will happen in order, but not always. Sometimes what it is really just trying to get to, the point is that these things are connected. Okay? These things are relevant to each other. And as we go through chapter 13 and we read about the destruction of Babylon, he says, and on that day, you will also, this will be how I will bring you and give you rest in verse 3. This is how I'll relieve you from all the pain and turmoil. They are connected. The downfall of Babylon is connected to the people's restoration that he promises them. There's a connection there. Okay? The same time, these things are going to happen together.
So what you're saying is very true, because if we look back at the Old Testament, when they were brought out of Egypt, promised the promised land, received the promised land, but before they could go in there, God specifically told them to kill these 7 nations: Hittites, Perizzites, Girgashites. Kill these people completely, and they did not. So what happens?
Yep.
Comes back to get you.
Yep.
So it's all connected. Do what you're told to do.
They struggled with not obeying that for years and years and years to come.
Right.
Yep. So in chapter 14, then this goes from this restoration back into this taunt specifically against the king of Babylon. And we see here just how high and mighty he thought of himself, and how low the king of Babylon is going to be brought down, right? So if we look at question what about question 8 in your workbooks? If we look at this whole section, there's a much larger section here about what the other nations compare to him. What would the kings of the other nations, what would the kings of the nations ask Babylon?
Verse 10. Yeah.
They respond to see, even you have been made weak as we. You have become like us. Look at verse 16 too. They will see you and gaze at you, and they'll ponder, saying, "Is this the man who made the earth tremble?" Right? Even these other nations are looking at him and just like, "Wow, this is extreme. This is a big change from the image they had of the king of Babylon before." Okay. Daniel gives us a little bit of insight about the kings of Babylon, right, and how they thought of themselves. So yeah, and we saw just how God brought them down and very quickly delivered them into the hands of their enemies. I like this imagery here in 22 and 23. I'll rise up against them, declares the Lord of hosts, and will cut off from Babylon name and survivors, offspring and posterity, declares the Lord. I will also make it a possession for the hedgehog. That's the verse 23 I was talking about earlier. The hedgehog and the swamps of water, and I will sweep it with the broom of destruction, declares the Lord. Again, the imagery of just how complete this destruction will be, like the image of a broom, a giant, massive broom going over the nation, and just the buildings just sweeping them away. Just that's how extreme it will be for this broom to just completely wipe out the nation.
As we've studied several times, where the promise of a remnant is for God's remnant being promised. Specifically here in verse 22, this remnant is going to end. There will be no remnant from Babylon or from this group. So I find that interesting. Where we see the promise of the remnant continuing, we see this. There is no more remnant after this.
Not for Babylon.
Right.
No. Proud king going to be dropped down. I already read a couple verses. I think we've got time then to get into some heavier topics. Even though I wanted to look at a couple more questions out of the book, but that's okay. Keep up with your workbooks, and remember, again, we do one lesson per week, or one lesson out of the workbook per time that we meet. So. And next week, I don't envy Lee. He's got 6 chapters to go through. So, whew. Okay, they're short-ish. Okay, but I just kind of open it up. If there's anything as you have done in your study, as you've gone through the book, as you have read through the chapters 13 and 14, open up before I get to a couple ideas and a couple things we could talk about. Anything that kind of hit you, anything that struck you through your study that you wanted to kind of talk a little bit more, and let's go into a little bit more detail about.
You were talking about the imagery, but I'll tell you what, verse 9 and 11 it's so disgusting. It says, Sheol from beneath is excited over you to meet you when you come. And then down in 11 it says, maggots are spread out as your bed beneath you, and worms are your covering. I mean, you can't get much worse than that.
Yeah. Yeah, the imagery for just how severe it will be is it can be pretty intense. And you know, if we look back in chapter 13 too, I mean the verbiage here is just the terror of his judgment is it's widespread fear. It is complete destruction. And you know what? When we look at that, and we think about the New Testament compared to what we get out of the Old Testament when looking at the Bible as a whole in our own lives, when we see places in the New Testament that says, here's the purpose of the Old Testament, it's a shadow of things to come. It is just the image. It's just something to help us realize that the Old Testament is talking about very physical, tangible things that we can grasp and that we can understand to help us relate to spiritual meanings, right? Heavenly ideas. And so this very physical judgment, the imagery is intense. Historically, we look back at what has happened to these nations. It's intense. When he talks about the day of the Lord coming upon these nations and the judgment that is said about these nations that have fallen. And then we go forward and read about the day of the Lord coming for us today. The very physical shadow that we see, compared to the reality, the physical, the spiritual that we will see in the future. If we don't pick up on that imagery, it may not sink in that, hey, this is a big deal. We know what's happened in the physical world, and if that is what we are prepared to, what we should be prepared for in the spiritual world, we have to be ready for that. We have to be ready. How can we not spread the gospel about, look, this type of destruction is what will happen if we don't look towards Christ as our salvation. He is our deliverer from that type of utter destruction.
And so I agree with her. My focus was on this man who, in verse 12, God asked him, how did you come to fall from the heavens?
Yeah.
And this is our reference to Lucifer.
Yeah.
But the section is called satire, and I'm an English major, so there's some use of language and things like exposition to expose you to the ridicule, to how people's stupidity, their vices and things. Because we look over in verse 20, and it says, how are you? You are never going to join them in the grave, for you have brought your country to ruin and destroyed your people. The offspring of the wicked will leave no name behind them. So it's total and utter destruction because it's enmity with God.
Yeah.
You cannot survive in a spiritual house.
Yeah. One of the things that people, what they live for is their legacy. They want their name to be known. They want to be remembered. They want their family to pass on behind them and carry out that legacy of them. They say, nope, that's how, there's going to be no legacy.
And I
no one will remember your name.
I worship at White Station Church right now. They had like 5 and 6 generations, and that's unheard of. Thankful people, 5 and 6 generations of family members and stuff.
Yeah.
And the worst thing that could happen to a nation, and this will be my last point, is it dissolves itself from the inside. It's ruined from the inside. Nobody attacked us, nobody tried to hurt us, but we're killing ourselves from the inside.
Yeah, you did it to yourself. I do want to also back up. You brought up verse 12, and I wanted to talk about that. Brother Harkrider has some strong opinion about verse 12 and its reference to the Babylonian king versus the idea of verse 12 and 13 focusing or being this reference to Lucifer, being a reference to Satan. And let's just read this for a little bit of context here. So it says, how you have fallen from heaven, O star of the morning, son of the dawn. You have been cut down to the earth. You have weakened the nations. I did want to talk about this a little bit because there is this just popular, it's a very heavily debate about whether this is referring to the king of Babylon versus, hey, is this referring to Satan? And Hartford, like I said, he's got a very strong stance that no, this is absolutely not the devil. He says this is clearly a Babylon and the king of Babylon. And I will agree to a point with him saying, look, the context is very, very clear. Okay, we are talking about Babylon. This is the destruction of Babylon. It's the oracle against Babylon. He's talking about the king. We know how much they lifted up themselves from, even from looking at Daniel and what happened to them and how they will fall. This glorious image of them and how they will fall and be destroyed. However, I will say that as we have looked through so many different prophecies and talked about telescoping prophecies and the way that we look forward to an event that is very close in time, but we also look forward to what happens later on, right? We've done this so many times with Christ and the church, with the day of Pentecost. We do this with prophecies over and over again, also looking at the restoration of the people. They're being brought out of Babylonian captivity, being the rebuilding of the temple. So many of these things, even when you look at David, so many of these things also line up and could be talking about multiple things. So I wouldn't go so far as to say, hey, maybe God is using this imagery also to talk about the devil, to talk about Lucifer. But I do want to also think of another angle from that. Some of the reasons why this is so heavily debated, and a section in Ezekiel too, is also debated when talking about the king of Tyre. Both of those have similar language, and similar language to New Testament times. And in Revelation 12, it talks about now war arose in heaven, and the great dragon was thrown down, that ancient serpent who is called the devil and Satan. In Luke 10, Jesus says, I saw Satan fall like lightning from heaven. 2 Corinthians in chapter 11, even Satan disguises himself as an angel of light. So the imagery that we read about in the New Testament has very similar imagery that Isaiah and Ezekiel use about this fallen star or falling from heaven, and literally speaking about Satan or the devil. It calls him out. But I wouldn't go so far as to say, and it could be, but I wouldn't always go so far to say that when we're looking at Isaiah and we're looking at Ezekiel, we're talking about the devil. And here's why. Remember that point I made just a little bit ago about Sodom and Gomorrah? We look back on Sodom and Gomorrah, and when we think of Sodom and Gomorrah, it brings to mind the absolute, utter destruction when we talk about the context of what's going on right now. That same type of logic would have been what the Jews and the New Testament Christians would have thought about when they heard that type of language, that falling from heaven, this star falling. They would have thought in their mind, because they're biblical experts on this, right? They would have thought back to Isaiah. They would have thought back to Ezekiel, and they would have said, oh, that's the same language used about the complete and utter destruction of Tyre and of Babylon. And it would have given more color to the things that were said in Revelation and Luke and 2 Corinthians about the complete and utter defeat of Satan. Okay? So we look back at those images, we look back to these the imagery in these chapters to help give color to the things that we read about in the New Testament. Now again, that's kind of the way I look at that, but God is God. He can do what he wants, and if this also refers to some of that same imagery, and there's a way to look at this and say, oh yeah, sure enough, I bet in Isaiah there's the devil. I'm not going to be really hard fast on that and say, no, God is not talking about that. I think that would be a little silly. But
yeah, I agree. If you're going to Isaiah 14 to look for some kind of origin story for the devil, that's not what this chapter is about. But if you can look at Isaiah 14 and say, there's a persona being built up here.
Yeah.
The Lucifer day star persona,
yeah,
that fits a lot of figures, whether it's Nebuchadnezzar or Satan or the Emperor of Rome or you, yeah, me. Yeah. Right? The idea of anybody propping himself up like he's the king of the world and more important than anybody else, and the fact that someday the grave is going to accept your body just like everybody else's, And I love this. It's almost Charles Dickens-like, or Edgar Allan Poe, the idea of the grave excitedly accepting you, and all the people from your life who you oppressed are sitting there going, well, now you're one of us, and you're dead, and just like everybody. It's like, it's so rich. And that can be anybody.
Mm-hmm.
And Satan, that's going to happen to Satan too. That's going to happen to Satan too. Matthew chapter 25, Jesus said at the end of that chapter, hell has been prepared for the devil and his angels. Revelation chapter 20, at the end of all things, the devil's going to be thrown down there in the lake of fire, right along with death. It's all going to go in there. And everybody who Satan oppressed, and everybody who lost their salvation because of Satan's work, they're going to be in hell, miserable for eternity, going, well, Satan, welcome to the mess that you helped make. And this is not Satan's origin story or some explanation of Satan, but this is definitely like a character that's been created, that's been crafted, that can be anybody.
Yeah, again, we just have to be careful about the extent that we take the imagery that's there for us to color the message that God is telling us today. Look, this could be you.
Yeah.
So let me say this. Like you said, it's about a character. It's about people's character. Maybe no one specifically, but down in outside at the end of 13, he said, I will climb to the heavens, and higher than the stars of God, I will set my throne.
Yeah.
I will sit on the mountain of assembly in the recesses of the north. I will climb to the top of the thunderclouds. I will rival the Most High. And turn over to Matthew 4, where Jesus was tempted by Satan.
Mm-hmm.
And he says, he took him to a very high mountain. The devil showed him all the kingdoms of the world and their splendor. And he said, I will give you all these if you fall at my feet and worship me. So we're looking for a character, not a flesh and blood person. So with our spiritual eyes, these are the things that we need to look for when we encounter other people.
Good point.
The ones that are arrogant, the ones that want to set themselves above and think above
And
act
not,
above.
not just other people. We have to catch that arrogance in ourselves, because God is very clear what He does with people that are overly prideful. Right? He will bring you down. He will humble you. You can humble yourself, or God will humble you.
Excellent.
Any other comments? We got just a couple minutes. All right, we'll go ahead and dismiss there. I think we got through enough of the chapter enough of the couple chapters here to understand them as a whole. We'll continue the message in lesson 8 in your workbooks. Next week, Lee will also be doing Sunday. I'll be out of town, so keep up with your workbooks and give him a hard time. Anyway, thank you for your time and attention this morning.
You got your bags packed?
No, I haven't even begun. No, I have to go. I can pack
You
it.
both bought one then.
Yeah.
He'll get over it.
It's not as big as
Yeah, exactly.
But that has its tendency to just go down and goes up. Just falls like that.
So a big one, huh?
Not quite the big
It's not a big flurry of
Yeah.
is that a higher price market?
Yeah, everything is more. It's very expensive, you know. The houses I'm looking at were, concrete block houses built in the late 60s, and
$150,000. So
It's-
it's much more now.
It's university town.
Right.
And so,
Florida's growing, the whole state is growing rapidly. People are moving for their political reasons and for tax reasons,
and the problem is that, insurance companies